So I'm so happy to be here and really excited to be following up. I almost feel like, well, our two talks merge really well together. So thank you to coaches for putting them together. My name is Teresa Focarile. I'm the Director of Educational Development at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Boise State University. And today my plan is for us to talk about how Centers for Teaching and Learning can act as partners in assessment. And obviously we just saw a really great example of that at Stanford. And what I'll be doing today is talking a little bit about how our center works with assessment both at the course and program level at Boise State, but also I saw from the chat in our introductions, we have people with a lot of great experience, both at CTLs and I'm imagining working with folks at CTLs. So also want to take some time for you all to share your expertise and also to ask questions. So with that introduction, I will move ahead. Our outcomes for today is that by the end, you should be able to explain how a CTL can support assessment both at the course and program level. And then we'll be brainstorming ways that CTLs can partner with other units on your campus. I'm going to skip this one, though I'm actually, well, I said I was going to skip it, and then I changed my mind immediately. I am interested, again, I saw from the introductions in the chat, a lot of you do work in a CTL, but I'm still curious if we could just see, for those of you who do work in a CTL, if you could share that in the chat, or if you've already partnered with a CTL on your campus or have some connection or don't yet have a connection. So let's just take a minute and pop those thoughts into the chat so we can get a sense of what your prior knowledge might be. Great, and I'm seeing a mixture of not yet and love to and working in a CTL. So that is great. So there'll be some new information as well as some expertise that you can draw from. So I will go ahead then and talk about the next slide. So since there are some of you who don't yet have experience working with the CTL, wanted to make sure that we all had a basic shared understanding of what the role of a CTL is on a campus. So in general, Centers for Teaching and Learning, and that's a general term, but it could be the Center for Effective Teaching or a variety of things. But the unit on campus that is there to support effective teaching practices. In general, they support evidence-informed teaching practice, as I said, faculty and stakeholders to work to improve student learning, and then course and curricula change, as we just saw in the example from Stanford. And they do this in a variety of ways. Kind of the bread and butter of CTL work has historically been workshops on specific teaching strategies. But those of us who work in CTLs also do direct consultations, both with faculty and departments. We can do classroom observations. We do longer institute kind of things, again, as the Stanford folks were talking about, or faculty learning community. So just some examples of what the work is, what our missions are, and then how we go about achieving those. So a little bit about CTLs and assessment. So what I'm talking about here is not just my own idea. There's a lot out there in the scholarly work around how CTLs help support assessment. And in particular, I'll draw this couple of pieces of information from the book Faculty Development in the Age of Evidence. And that builds on years of looking at and talking with CTLs about what is the work that they do. So in this book, so from studies that they did in 2016, the CTLs that participated in that study supporting assessment of student learning outcomes was the 4th highest focus reported by CTL. So very much an important part of what CTLs do. And what was interesting is that the mean of how much of a part of that CTLs that work is has actually grown since the 2006 when they had done that survey before. So had been an important part and continues to be an even more important part of what CTLs do. I think that ties a little bit to what Erica was talking about in our breakout about the kind of increase in assessment, and those of you who work in assessment offices can speak to kind of an increased focus on institutions of higher ed needing to show evidence of their success, and then CTLs being able to support that. And again, that will be a great way for all of us to talk and brainstorm in a little bit. So a little bit about the context of Boise State before I give some examples of specifically how we all in our center support assessment. So Boise State, here's our blue field. If you weren't familiar with Boise State, if you were familiar, you might only know about us by the blue field, but we have a blue football field. But beyond that, we are a public metropolitan R2 institution in Boise, Idaho. The figures here in terms of student numbers are from last year, but still pretty reflective of where we are this year. About 27,000 students, mostly undergraduate students, about 1,500 faculty, and of that, 57% are full-time, and that full-time number includes both tenure and non-tenure track. And we have 7 academic colleges and about 200 degree programs. The mission of our CTL at Boise State is, again, similar, I would imagine, to most CTLs around the country. We support innovative, transformative, and equitable education at Boise State University, promote excellent teaching, empowering educators in their ongoing growth as scholarly practitioners, and help the university advance the public good by creating spaces for instructors to learn in community. This is a photo from our Christmas party this year. So we're all in holiday wear, as you might have noticed. And you also might have noticed from the size of this picture, the size of CTLs across the country. We're fortunate to have 12 full-time staff, as well as about 5 or 6 student workers. So I also acknowledge that what I'll be talking about in terms of the kind of work we can support might be different than those of you who are coming from CTLs of 1 or places where there are not yet CTLs, and that's certainly something that we can talk about. Okay, so as I said, there's 2 different ways that are 2 different buckets of how our CTL supports assessment at Boise State. The course level and the program level. And what I've listed here on this slide are just some examples of how we do each of those things. So, for example, to support course level assessment, we do course design programs. We have both an institute and an academy. One of those is in person, one of those is online, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. We also do an institute for instructors who teach our first year courses. So a similar goal to what the Stanford folks shared in terms of supporting those first year students and thinking about equity in those courses. Our CTL also hosts and houses our service learning program at Boise State. So there's course design support for those instructors. And then we also do consultations and mid-semester assessments that often get at the assessment practices in a particular course. So there's a variety of ways that we work directly one-on-one with faculty to help support how they think about assessment in their particular course. We also work with departments on program level assessment in support and collaboration with our Office of Institutional Effectiveness. So we do that again through workshops. As I mentioned, I'm facilitating a workshop next week to help those who are going through our program assessment reporting this year to think about how their program learning outcomes align with our university learning outcomes. So an example of the kind of thing that we talk about in those workshops. We also do direct one-on-one consultations on those topics. And the thing that I'll talk about a little bit more in depth in just a few minutes is that we help train those faculty members who serve as reviewers in our program assessment reporting process, and do that in a way that is also meant to develop those faculty in that area. So those are some big pictures, and I just want to quickly look at the chat. And yes, you will have access to my presentation in just a few minutes. I will put those in the chat. And Erica had a question, are program assessment workshops voluntary or required? So that's a really important point. Thank you, Erica, for bringing that up. All of the programs that our CTL offers are voluntary. That includes our new faculty orientation, which I didn't list on here because it's not specific to assessment. But yes, so all of our programs are voluntary, including those for programs that are undergoing our program review assessment process. And you're welcome. Okay. So just a little bit more specifically then into what it looks like for us to do course level assessment support. So our first example that I had shared on the previous slide was our Course Design Institute. So this is a type of program that a lot of CTLs have. In our case, it's a 4-day event that we do every year in May, where we bring about 32 faculty members together to learn or relearn the process of backwards course design, and along the way, helping them to incorporate inclusive teaching practices and universal design for learning principles. So this is very much something where we are helping them think through, what do you want your students to learn and how will you know if they did that? So one of the ways that we internally assess the effectiveness of our programs is to do a pre and post survey of participants' confidence in particular areas related to the outcomes of that program. And there's a chunk of those that are related to course level assessment. So, and again, this is obvious, well, I should say not again. This is a indirect measure of the effectiveness and impact of this program, but does speak to what we see as the success of this program. So the first assessment related outcome that we have for this program is that participants will be able to define summative and formative assessment. And in our pre and post here, that's what the two numbers represent. We saw an increase of 0.9 on a scale of 1 to 4. We also hope that they design summative assessments that align with their course learning outcomes. Again, this past year, we saw an increase in that number. We want them to develop summative assessments that engage students in authentic tasks. And again, saw growth there, and include choices for students in their summative assessments. This is specifically related to universal design for learning. And we saw a growth there as well. So for our goals that we have for what faculty will be able to do in terms of assessment, we find that that program is really impactful. And finally, that they are able to apply strategies for creating transparent summative assessments. And again, we saw growth here, the biggest area of growth besides the previous one. So that was good for us to see, that we believe that this is having an impact and helping faculty create assessments in their course. I see Julie had a question. Are participants cohorts or individuals? Typically individuals. We do sometimes have faculty who are team teaching participate in it together, but usually in the Course Design Institute, it's individual participants. I'm going to pause here before I talk about the example of our program level assessment to see if there are any questions or comments that folks have, either that you want to add in the chat or you want to unmute and share.
Good
Yeah,
question,
Enrique.
yes. Can you elaborate more on the faculty? Are there coordinators
sure.
working with the teaching,
Yeah,
center?
great.
Are there other faculty? Are there coordinators, specific coordinators assigned for in that area or different areas? How does
Yeah.
that go?
That's a great question. So for our Course Design Institute, it is, as like all of our other programs, completely voluntary, and we just open a sign-up form. So it's really faculty from all over the institution of all ranks who, for a variety of reasons, are interested in designing or redesigning their course and getting support for that. So it is, sometimes we do get people who are coordinating a course, and so the work that they're doing would be passed on to other faculty, but the majority of the people who participate are individual faculty members who are working on a particular course that they alone teach.
Okay,
Yeah.
so not necessarily you have, like, like me, I am the SLO coordinator, right? Working in conjunction with the program view coordinator, with the pathways coordinator, with curriculum coordinator, with the instructional design coordinator. Not necessarily in that manner, right? But this is just.
Yes, yeah. So this is just whichever faculty would be interested in getting this kind of support. Yeah, so completely voluntary. We do do some outreach to chairs to make sure that they pass on the information to their faculty. In general, and I think this ties to something that Erica was talking about in our breakout room, so perhaps we'll get into this a little bit as well. In general, the approach that our CTL and many other CTLs take is that we are a supportive place. We want to be very clear that we are not the place where people get sent when they need to fix their teaching. So what we find then often is the people who are coming are already the choir or already people who are really open to these kinds of ideas. So yes, again, all completely voluntary, self-identified.
And one more last question.
Yeah.
And do you have a physical center, a physical space,
Oh.
or just?
Such great questions. Thank you. Yes, so we have a physical space on campus. We actually have 2 physical spaces right now, but our main space has office space as well as a room that we use for our in-person workshops. Yeah, great question. Erica had in the chat, are these items matched with comparable self-reports from students during the mid-semester inquiry? That is a great question, Erica. So one of the things that we have not done, I won't put a value statement on that, we just haven't done it, is a lot of follow-up beyond this pre-post survey on the impact of what the Course Design Institute is. But that is something that we're looking to do in the future, is make sure that we're gathering more data on the both the longer term impact for the faculty member, but also importantly, the actual impact that whatever these faculty learned are actually having on students in the courses. So one of the ways that we have thought about doing that is encouraging our participants in the Course Design Institute to have some kind of mid-semester feedback from their students and particularly ask some questions around that. So now you've prompted my brain to make sure that we try to do that for this fall. So that's one of the things we've been thinking about doing, but haven't yet done. Great, thank you for that. And the reminder. Okay, so I'll go ahead and give you the example of how we support assessment at the program level, and then we can chat about that a little bit. So as I mentioned, we partner with our Office of Institutional Effectiveness in a variety of ways around our institution's program assessment reporting process. A quick little bit about that. So that's officially tied to our accreditation. We're accredited by NWCCU. And for that purpose, we need to show evidence of how we assess student learning here at Boise State. The process that our institution has developed was developed with the goal of being as formative as possible. So as many carrots and as few sticks as possible in the process. And so part of that is it's a 3-year cycle. And each year our CTL offers workshops and consultations in support of programs going through the process. And happy to talk about that a little bit. But what I wanted to focus on here, because it is a bit unique in terms of how Boise State handles our program assessment process, is that once programs submit their reports, they are reviewed by teams of faculty members and peer reviewers. So they are not then kind of sent on to administration to look at. There are groups of faculty who come together and use a rubric to provide ratings and feedback to programs. And then that feedback is returned to the programs. Usually, so the feedback is gathered in May and returned to them in August at the beginning of the semester. So our CTL partners with the Office of Institutional Effectiveness on that training. And the training then is a mixture of kind of nuts and bolts. Here's all the things you need to know about how the program assessment process works. But we also really support that formative nature of the process. We do a couple of rounds of norming. We really dig into what does it mean to have effective learning outcomes and measures and findings. And what we have found, because my collaborator in that, Sherry Ellerson, and I have presented on this in a variety of ways, is that the training really serves as a faculty development opportunity around assessment. On this slide, I have a couple of quotes that we have heard from faculty who have participated, that they have learned things in the process that they are applying, both at the course and program level, about how it's helping them to better understand assessment. For example, faculty saying they're a lot more explicit about the learning outcomes in their individual courses and how those then apply to program and university outcomes. And I really like this last quote, so that's why I put it in here. The most important thing I take back to both my department and my own teaching is don't ask students to do something you can't assess. So, and I imagine there might be people on this Zoom that have differing opinions about that particular quote, but that is one of my favorites there. I'm gonna again pause here and answer Julie's question in the chat, but also see if folks have follow-up questions, which you probably do, because that was a very general introduction to what that program is. But Julie asked, is the Course Design Institute in person, hybrid, or online? So let me first address that by saying historically it has been in person. This year we expanded into what we called the Course Design Academy and did that fully online, asynchronously. And I should give some credit to our colleagues at the Center for Teaching and Learning oh goodness, I'm going to put that in the chat later. One of our colleagues at an institution in North Carolina was a real inspiration for us moving it to an online model. So we offer it in both ways. Quick version of what happens over the 4 days, and I can add this information into the slides so that if you come back to them, you can look at it. We focus on writing effective learning outcomes and then aligning the assessments to those outcomes, but also helping faculty think about authentic assessment, transparent assessment, offering students choice. We then spend some time on aligning activities to prepare students for those assessments. And then we have a day where we're bringing all those things, those concepts together. The participants submit work each day and we give them feedback on it. And we have built a rubric for that and range of experience of knowledge of the participants. So that's a great question for actually both of the examples that we're talking about here. One of the things that we do in both of these things is have faculty working together. So if you are coming in with more experience in course design than someone else, you're working in groups and able to share and learn from each other. The other thing is that we're doing a lot of active learning and application. So if you, for example, on the topic of learning outcomes, there's some material that you would look at before you come in. If you need a refresher, we talk about it a little bit, but mostly what people are doing are activities. So if you already came in with a lot of knowledge, you still get a lot of practice and work time. And if it's a new concept to you, you get a lot of in-person feedback and interaction. Let's see. I'm just looking at some of the other chats. You should not ask students to do things that you will enjoy assessing and providing feedback. I think you mean that you will not enjoy assessing, right? Yes, yes, great. Okay. Questions or thoughts about the program level assessments and our peer review process?
I do have a question.
Yes.
What's the process of getting faculty involved to be reviewers?
Yeah. So again, like many things, it's completely volunteer. We recruit faculty from across the institution. They are compensated a small amount, about $250 for their time, because it is done in May when they're off contract. So there's a bit of compensation. There's a variety of reasons why people sign up. There are certainly the people who are like all of us on this call, right? Self-prescribed assessment nerds, right? They just love thinking about assessment and doing it with other people who like to do that. We also have people who are maybe their program's going to go through the assessment process the next year and they want to get kind of an inside scoop, make sure they really understand the kinds of things that reviewers are thinking about. So we have that population. And then we sometimes have a little bit of population of people who have been politely voluntold, and mostly that's because we do try to get faculty from across the university and at least one faculty member from each college. So sometimes they're kind of volunteered by their department, but I would say 95% of the people are there because they're really interested in diving into it. And the peer reviewers are selected mostly just based on who applies, because we don't often get so many more people than we need. That said, we do also try each year to have a few new people in the process. So a lot of the people, we've had some people who have done it every year since we had started. So for 7 years, they have served as a peer reviewer. And each year we have probably 2 or 3 new people that we're getting into the mix as well. And the program was originated in a collaboration between administration and faculty. I do have some, Sherry and I have presented on this topic. So when I update the slides, I'll just put a link to those that presentation information in here as well. Let me just make a note about that. Great. Okay. So just a couple of other things, and then I want to get to us all learning from each other. So the work that we do in the CTL, I just want to point out all the different ways that we partner: individual faculty, groups of faculty, department chairs. As I've said, our Office of Institutional Effectiveness. We work really closely with our office that handles our general education curriculum. We partner with our Dean of Students office and our academic advising office. So even if you are joining here today, not in a CTL, hopefully you can see some ways that you might be able to partner with one. And Julie, I see your question in the chat. I just want to pop over to the next slide so folks can think about the answers to these prompts. So this is the portion, and I'll probably put these questions in the chat and maybe stop sharing my slides for a little bit so we can all see each other. But would love to hear from all of you. If you work in a CTL, what's one thing you do to support assessment? Or if you partner with a CTL, would love to hear about that. Or if you have an assessment related goal for your campus, you could ask some questions about how a CTL could help. And there's lots of CTL people here who could help answer that. So while you're thinking about those questions, Julie, I'll respond. We do class observations throughout the year, and those are actually a separate, completely separate program. So the classroom observations that we offer in the CTL are not connected to the program assessment process. It's just individual faculty who perhaps are thinking, my students aren't as engaged as I want. Can you come watch the class and give me some suggestions? Or there's a particular learning disruption challenge they're having, or they're trying an active learning thing for the first time and want to try that out. So there's a variety of reasons why they might do that. And those are observations are pretty much exclusively done by CTL staff. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I see people are putting ideas in the chat and I want to be able to see those, but I will also put these questions in the chat. And then I will look at what's happening in the chat and we can all talk about it. And if you wanted to share something and unmute, you can just raise your hand and unmute and we will talk about those. To your institution's instructional design team. So Yvonne asked a question about if we partner or coordinate efforts with our institution's instructional design team. So the way it works at Boise State is that in our Center for Teaching and Learning, we don't currently have anyone who is a trained instructional designer, though we do have a lot of staff who are knowledgeable about effective course design. Our institution has divided up support for in-person courses and online courses. So we do have a partner unit, which is called the eCampus Center, that specifically supports online courses, and they are fully staffed with instructional designers. There are instances where we'll partner on an offering. I was just emailing with my counterpart in eCampus today about a session they already have planned on writing and AI that the first year, I'm sorry, that the writing center director is leading. So we'll partner on something like that and promote it out to all faculty in that way. Paula, do we ever collaborate to develop program and learning assessment for student affairs? No, we have not done that. I did do a workshop for our partners in academic advising when they were looking at updating their learning outcomes and how they might assess them. But typically we have not worked with student affairs. Would love to think more about how we might be able to do that. And there's a couple of new ones, but if there's anyone who would want to share anything verbally, you're welcome to raise your hand and unmute while I'm still reading other chats. Erica, I may or may not be looking directly at you in my CTL window, because you were sharing some interesting things about CTLs and assessment in our breakout room.
Yeah, I'll share as well for I think it was Paula's question. My CTL is part of a broader division of undergraduate education, which includes some programs that at other institutions might be organized under a student affairs umbrella. If anyone is interested in learning more about student affairs assessment, there is like a ton of resources out there, and I recommend you look at the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders group. They are a group much like this one. Yeah, thank you, Amy. And our CTL does support the units in our division who are running programs for students that are part of the co-curriculum and trying to help those units develop. Sometimes they're learning outcomes, but sometimes they're not learning outcomes. And I think one of the things that assessment folks sometimes have to like let go of is not every outcome is a learning outcome, and it can still be assessed. But we do have something like that. Yeah.
Teresa, I have a question.
Yes.
Going back to what the previous question was regarding the non-instructional programs, like, the service or student affairs divisions or areas or units, if you want to call it. How do you engage discussion, specifically with assessments results?
Oh, so for the program assessment process, as I said, the peer reviewers meet in May and the results go back to the programs in August. And the final piece of our process is that the programs get kind of one last chance to provide some feedback or information. They submit a response report usually at the end of October that includes what they've done so far with the information, what, if anything, about their plans have changed, and then might specifically ask for any additional support that they might need. So there's a couple of things then in terms of follow-up that our office will start doing in the fall. There's three things. One is that we will look at when all of the feedback is compiled, we'll look at that overall to identify where are the areas that programs are still having challenge. So for example, when we first started our program assessment process in 2017, we had a lot of programs that got lower ratings around program learning outcomes. And so we did a lot of support around that kind of basic part of program assessment. Now what we're seeing is that I would say off the top of my head, 85 to 90% of programs are in the established or developing level of program learning outcomes. So we can kind of check off that, yes, most people now understand what it means to write an effective program learning outcome. What we're seeing though is that programs are still struggling with the key. So our programs are asked to report out on what your learning outcomes are, how you're measuring them, what you're finding, and then what you plan to do about what you found. And it's those last two areas that programs are still struggling with. They know what they want students to learn and they have some ideas about how to measure them, but what to do with that information is still an area where there's room for growth. And so we'll look at that data to identify what our workshops should be in the coming year. So that's the first piece. The second piece is we'll read all of those reports that programs then submit in the fall to see, did anyone specifically call out that they needed support, or is what they're planning something we could support them with? And so then we'll do some outreach there. And we'll also just do a general, if there are, we'll do a general review of all of the feedback to maybe self-identify some programs that we'd want to reach out to. So in that way, we're using the results of the PAR process to help us better target our support for the program assessment process.
Great, great. So you have this this year-round cycle of assessments, right? Excuse me, of assessments, that a continuous improvement of assessments through your courses, through your programs. And does that stop, or it continues year-round?
Well, the PAR process itself is programs report once every 3 years. So I usually only interact with programs in the year coming up to their reporting or maybe immediately following. We sort of frame the PAR process as, we know that you're doing assessments all of the time, and this is just your time to pop your head up and share all the great things you're doing about assessing student learning. So we expect that the process is happening at the program level all the time, and this is just our check-in points. So yes, I think that answers your question.
It's kind of like a program review type of thing?
Yes,
Oh, okay.
yeah. We
Thank
do
you.
have a separate program review process. This is
Mhm.
just the focusing on student learning part.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. The program reviews actually also don't have an administrative review. What our Office of Institutional Effectiveness does is produces a summary report that goes to each of the deans that just, well, there's a university level report that's big picture summary, and then each of the deans receive a report that shares the ratings that each of the programs in their college received, but doesn't include access to the reports themselves. So presumably, if a dean notices that a program is getting lower numbers than they would anticipate, they'll have that conversation with the department chair. So, but that's how that process works. The origin of the structure for accreditation and academic assessment at Boise State. Okay, so this is actually good, and I'm looking at Bree's question, and that ties into one of the discussion questions that I wanted us to get to. So Bree asked, I collaborate with institutional effectiveness, and what's the organizational structure for accreditation and academic assessment at Boise State? So at Boise State, our accreditation and academic assessment is under the purview of one of our vice provosts, and the Office of Institutional Effectiveness reports directly to that vice provost. The institutional assessment portion itself is about 10% of the workload of the Office of Institutional Effectiveness and about 5% of my workload. So it's part of that institution's work, but there are limited numbers of full-time staff that have direct support of it. So it's certainly an area where our institution has recently started to give more funding. And when this PAR process started in 2016, it was identified that faculty and programs would need the faculty development support to make it happen. And our director at the time wanted to be really clear, again, getting to that, where is the role of CTLs in assessment piece, wanted to be really clear that our CTL was there to help with the development, but we were not going to be involved in any of the administration of the process. And so my colleague Sherry and I work really closely to make sure that any communication about here's when things are due, or here's the paperwork, or here's the requirements, that all comes from her office. And my office is just about, hey, we know you're going to do this thing, and we are here to help you do it well. So we try to make sure that that's really a clear divide. Erica, did you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wanted to just sort of highlight or shine a light on, I think, something that is important that we don't, it's just in my experience, I've worked now in like an assessment space and a CTL space. I've been, I don't know. And I think that there is a clear, like, professional divide, not an insurmountable one, but an important one to say out loud, that I think in many offices where assessment professionals are housed, they are driven by standards that apply to everyone, whether that is an accreditation standard or some other kind of institutional infrastructure. And part of their role is to ensure that all of these oars are rowing in the same direction towards these standards. And then at occasional moments of their careers, they have to really prove it. And I think that is a key distinction between a faculty support space, or a space that kind of holds itself apart from, and actually like does not want to get in that muck at all, because it will damage a key the relational capital, which is a key currency for a CTL. And I think that frustrates things in certain ways. I don't know what to do. I'm not trying to like point out a problem with no solution, because what has frustrated me in the past is the association of assessment folks as like these data crunching like technocrats who really just want to, like, everything has to be like observed and checked off, and it's all, and then that is felt as really like bureaucratic to the faculty who are in the classrooms with the students. But then likewise on the other side, I've felt disappointed in CTLs that they are not necessarily joining into the rhetoric of institutional accountability. That part of what a job of a CTL is to ensure that faculty are teaching as well as they possibly can, because that is what we owe to the students, not just theoretically, but also like materially, because of however you want to describe like what the social contract is between an institution and its students. So I just think like that divide of like the sort of requirement of standards on the one side, and then the voluntary like welcoming in without alienating anybody on the other side. Like, and I'm painting this as like in too contrasting of a light. I think in real life this is not actually, it's a lot, many more shades of gray than this, but I think like that orientation to different paradigms is like a really important distinction. And it's one that we have to navigate in these collaborations. And we can't navigate a collaboration if we don't own the ways that we're willing to say like, no, sorry, you have to do this. You are required. This is mandatory or not, right? I think, anyway, I just talked for a long time. Thanks for letting me share.
I think this is a really good point of conversation, and I'll just put in the chat because I would love for us to be able to dive into this a little bit. So I was thinking if we had time, we could also have a conversation. For those of you who are in the slides right now, on slide 14, there's a few takeaways and kind of future predictions that the book Faculty Development in the Age of Evidence includes. And one of them is around assessment, a potential future danger in having assessment defined too narrowly on demonstration of student learning outcomes, and using it for accountability, restricting the role of developers to that of assessment comps. So just what you're talking about there, Erica, that from the field of CTL, that seems to be a really big concern of assessment comps. But I think you're bringing up a really good question of what is the responsibility of the institution, and how does an office that supports faculty development, at what point should they be responsible for actually showing that they are leading to improvement in those areas?
And that I'll just sort of add that the rhetoric that I feel that the rhetoric that I've heard that assessment is about policing, and it's even in that quote of cops, right? I've never heard that rhetoric coming out of assessment practitioner networks. I've just never heard that. I think a lot of assessment practitioners consider them, and there's like scholarship on what the like professional identities of assessment professionals, that they don't consider themselves in that way. Maybe they are positioned that way, but I would ask I ask this of my own CTL all the time, to not promote that rhetoric that assessment is about policing. Because I don't feel that coming out of assessment spaces the way I feel it coming out of educational development spaces.
Can I just piggyback on that? Like, I certainly don't ever think of it that way, but does it depend on where you're located? So if you're in a teaching and learning center, you're less likely to be seen that way. If you're in an institutional effectiveness office that's managing accountability, you might be, but it also might be what are your marching orders? Like if your marching orders are to, which I think in the assessment world, we see our marching orders as facilitating assessment growth, and exactly the way Teresa has been articulating it, and the people from Stanford also, that we're trying to, and that's why that relational that phrase about the relational currency was like, whoa, that's exactly right. That's all we've got. That's all we've got. We have for the most part, we have no authority. I mean, I guess the teaching and learning center does, but I'm a lowly assessment person in my institution. I've got no authority at all. All I've got is relationships and people who want to learn things, and I can support them in that. So it's the first time hearing about policing. I don't know if Karen, who's on this call also, has thoughts from the grand challenges. Is that a way we think about assessment, or who thinks about assessment that way? Anyway, thanks.
I think she conveniently, unfortunately, just left the meeting, so you'll have to have her on a future session to talk about that. Sure.
Great discussion, yeah.
Other thoughts from assessment professionals about your role, or maybe how you have partnered with CTLs, or see yourselves aligned or not aligned with the work of CTLs?
One more thing.
Yeah.
So I come to the work, and I'm always saying to people, faculty in particular, this isn't about the accreditor. It's about improving outcomes for students. It's about learning. Like, you should do it because it's the right thing to do. And now we're in an accreditation year, and that goes out the window. No, you have to do it because we need it for accreditation. So that's also, so I guess where you are in your accreditation cycle also impacts how you're perceived and what you need to do.
Well, I think to your point, Amy, sorry, this is Brie Lauka. I think to your point, I think it depends on the cycle, and then also the type of institution, because I think public institutions versus private institutions have different perspectives on accreditation, on requirements, and how they're conceptualizing those things. At least that's been my experience so far. But I'm curious to hear from people too. Like, my experience with Centers for Teaching and Learning and Assessment is that there is a question of ownership, and that a lot of Centers for Teaching and Learning are doing work on assessment and on rubrics and aligning, pedagogy and assessments to the learning outcomes for a course and supporting that at an individual level. But then that when it's offered by the assessment office on campus, that faculty say, oh, well, I've been working with them, and do I work with you too? Or like, who do I work with? And there's a confusion of who is the expert, and not that no one wants to have like ownership over these things or be territorial, but making sure that we're in alignment, number one, that we're doing it in a way that's meaningful, but also then the awareness, like you said, of who's communicating their requirement process, of how you're submitting data, and that we're designing in a way that is aligned with that, but not in a way that's compliance oriented, but that's improvement oriented. So how that all gets communicated and is systematic and coordinated across the institution.
Yes, and I would say that I think that's one thing that we are hopefully doing pretty well at right now at Boise State, which is, so there's another office that is involved in institutional level assessment, and that's our University Foundations, which is our general education curriculum office. And so we have regular meetings, myself, the director of institutional effectiveness, and the director of the University Foundations, because they also do assessment of our general education curriculum and report to that committee. And so I think one thing that we're doing well is all three of us are talking regularly about what are the things that we're looking to see, how are we aligning our processes and our language, and how are we aligning the faculty development around those things. So that has been a help, definitely a help in our institution, is that we are all thinking about those things together. I did put in the chat, and then I think there was another hand up. I did, and we have 8 minutes. Put in the chat a link to a presentation that my colleague Sherry and I did about our feedback process, which also has some information about the ways in which Boise State is approaching that, the program assessment reporting, which is very much, Amy, in the way that you were talking about it, right? This is, we try very quickly, if at all, to talk about, oh yeah, this is because we have to do it for the accreditors. We get that quickly out of the way and talk more about why is it meaningful for us to be doing this work, and how is the process hopefully setting that up so it's meaningful for the program. So we try to really lead with that language, and only when we need a really, really big stick does Sherry talk about the accreditor portion of that. Yes, communicating on the faculty side, arguing that the future of assessment work is in CTLs. Oh, I will have to find out what that presentation was about. Thank you, Erica, for putting that in there. Was there another question? Did someone have their hand up?
Real quick, I just,
Yeah.
and I think Amy was alluding to this. I never heard that policing, assessments, but it comes back to best practices, right? We don't use best practices. Who knows what best practices from discipline to discipline? And so we're just trying to focus on what we are as faculty, is to focus on the skills and competencies.
Mhm.
At the end of the day, we really need to do that. And so when we at City College, are trying to say, hey, we're not policing here, we're not trying to use best practices, because what is best practices, right? So at the end of the day is, if my son is taking English 1A, what skills will he have to carry on when he transitions into a four-year institution or what have you?
Mhm.
So
Yes, very much the way that our program assessment process is framed is that way. At the basic level, what is it that you want your students to know, and how do you know if they know it by the time they finish their degree? So we really try to focus on that. This is a really great conversation, and I wish it could continue, but we have 6 minutes left. And because this is a presentation on assessment, I wanted to add some assessment at the end. So I'm going to just put this in the chat. It's on slide 16 if you're in the slides, but could you please write a 1-sentence summary of how a CTL can support assessment efforts at your institution? And don't post yet. Give everybody a minute to think about it. If you don't have a CTL at your institution, are there elements of what we talked about today that you think could be integrated? Or are there further questions that you would have about how you might be able to support this kind of work at your institution? So I'll give you all a little bit more to have an answer ready to put in the chat. And then go ahead and start sharing them, and we'll see what people took away. So Jarek has focused discussion. A CTL can help focus discussion about assessment of student learning and why it's different from grading. Yes, we do have that conversation a lot. Aligning courses to program learning outcomes in course design workshops, help facilitate discussions. Yes, assessing your own efforts. Great. Assessing critical thinking skills. Great. And the idea of the faculty reviewers and the slides that I linked in the chat, and I've now added the link to the slides from today, has more information if you'd like to learn more about our peer review process. So then the last thing is just, I'll put my email address in the chat. So if you would I'd love to follow up on these conversations and hear more about it. And for those of you who work in CTLs and are attending the pod conference in Chicago, I will be there and we can talk about that more, or would look forward to conversations, any follow-up conversations. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here today.